On a cold Tuesday in November, 52-year-old Foster Cray handed over a cashier's check for $7,200 and signed his name to 40 acres of collapsed mine ground in Barlow County, Idaho that the county assessor had valued at less than the cost of fencing it. The Delacroix estate, three siblings who'd inherited the old Wren Gulch silver claim from their father and wanted nothing to do with it, shook his hand and left without asking a single question about why a retired man would want ground that had produced nothing but liability since the mine shut down in the 1990s. Why would they ask? They'd just sold 40 acres of caved-in tunnels, rusted headframe timber, and a scattering of collapsed adits that the state's abandoned mine safety office had flagged twice for reclamation funding nobody had ever gotten around to spending. Nobody in Barlow County thought Foster Cray had made a sound decision. The feed store had theories. His own son called him from Boise to ask, gently, if this was some kind of midlife project he needed to talk through. And somewhere in the flooded lower workings of that abandoned silver mine, beneath ground everyone else had written off decades earlier, sat a slow, steady flow of water running nearly 90 degrees warmer than anything a shallow Idaho aquifer should produce, a resource that independent geothermal engineers would eventually value at several $1 million in long-term energy potential. Nobody knew, not the Delacroix family, not the county, not the state. Nobody except, eventually, Foster. If stories about ordinary people who see what others miss inspire you, subscribe and join us. We bring you real rural stories with real lessons behind them. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if the story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find people who care about stories like Foster's. Now let's find out exactly how a collapsed silver mine changed one man's life for good. Foster Cray was not a romantic about land. He'd spent 29 years as a mining engineer, most of them underground in one capacity or another, working for 3 different operations across Idaho, Montana, and eastern Nevada before a knee injury and a company buyout combined to push him into early retirement 2 years before the story starts. He didn't talk about rock formations the way people talk about scenery. He talked about them the way a mechanic talks about an engine, competent, specific, entirely unsentimental. He was 52 when he signed that check, a broad-shouldered man with the particular quiet of someone who'd spent decades in places too loud or too dangerous for casual conversation. He'd grown up in Barlow County, the son of a hard rock miner who'd worked the same Wren Gulch district his whole career, and Foster had gone underground himself the summer after high school, eventually earning his engineering degree through night classes while working full shifts, the kind of path that gave him both formal training and an instinctive feel for rock and water that no classroom alone could teach. His wife, Renata, had passed away 3 years earlier from ovarian cancer, a fast, brutal decline that had taken barely 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. Foster had spent the following 2 years doing what a lot of men in his position do, working consulting contracts he didn't need the money for, keeping busy in a way that looked, from the outside, like coping. His son Danny, an accountant in Boise, worried about him more than Foster ever let on, and had said as much more than once, in the kind of gentle, circling way adult children worry about a parent living alone. When Foster saw the Wren Gulch listing that October 40 acres, collapsed mine priced for salvage value, he didn't see a liability. He saw a problem he understood better than almost anyone else in the state, and problems, for a man who'd spent his whole career solving them underground, had always been easier to sit with than grief. He spent 3 weeks before the purchase doing what engineers do: studying. He pulled the state's old mine safety records, reviewed the original 1970s survey maps from when Wren Gulch was still an active silver operation, and drove out to walk the surface workings 3 separate times before he ever made an offer. He talked to a retired mine safety inspector named Herb Talcott, who'd overseen the district's closure decades earlier and remembered, vaguely, something odd about water temperatures in the lower workings that nobody had ever fully investigated before the mine flooded and everyone moved on. The mine's history wasn't a mystery to anyone in the county. It was an old story. Wren Gulch had produced steadily for 60 years before silver prices and increasingly marginal ore grades made continued operation unprofitable in the early 1990s. The mining company had done minimal closure work, capping the main shaft and letting the lower levels flood naturally, the standard, cheapest approach at the time for a played-out claim nobody expected to matter again. A partial collapse in the upper adits 5 years later had made the surface even less appealing, caving in what little infrastructure remained and turning the property into exactly the kind of ground county assessors valued at scrap price. When Foster told his neighbor, Grady Pemberton, who ran a small cattle operation adjoining the old claim, what he was planning, Grady was direct about it. "Foster, that ground's been dead longer than the mine's been closed. Water in those lower levels will kill you faster than the rock will. You're going to spend a retirement's worth of money proving what everybody already knows." The county's mine safety liaison, a careful, by-the-book woman named Deborah Sims, was more diplomatic but said essentially the same thing, that the reclamation costs alone would likely exceed anything the ground could be worth for grazing or recreational use. Foster listened to every objection carefully. He'd learned, over 3 decades underground, that objections usually contained real information even when the conclusion was wrong, and he wrote each one down before he ever committed to buying. What Foster had noticed, and what nobody else had bothered to calculate, traced back to something Herb Talcott had mentioned almost as an aside during their conversation, that the lower workings, flooded since closure, had never fully cooled the way a shallow mine typically would. Herb couldn't say for certain, decades removed from the closure work and relying on old memory, but he recalled water coming up warm enough in the deepest levels that crews joked about it at the time without anyone taking it especially seriously. Foster took that offhand memory more seriously than Herb himself had. Idaho sits along the edge of several documented geothermal zones. The same volcanic and tectonic history that produces the state's well-known hot springs also created localized areas where groundwater, heated at depth by the Earth's natural thermal gradient, could rise through fault lines and old mine workings far warmer than surrounding shallow aquifers. Most such anomalies in Idaho had never been mapped in detail, since accessing deep, isolated hot zones typically required expensive drilling that nobody had reason to fund on marginal ground. Wren Gulch's old shaft, already sunk more than 800 feet by the original mining company decades earlier, offered something rare. Existing, pre-drilled access into exactly the kind of depth where a real geothermal anomaly might be found, if one existed at all, without the enormous drilling costs that normally made such prospecting financially impossible on a small property. After the purchase, Foster didn't rush. For the first 2 months, he focused entirely on safety, working with a licensed mine reclamation contractor to stabilize the collapsed upper adits and secure safe surface access to the original shaft collar, the kind of methodical, unglamorous work that convinced Grady Pemberton his neighbor had, at minimum, no intention of getting himself killed chasing an old miner's 50-year-old memory. In January, once the shaft access was secured, Foster lowered a series of temperature probes into the flooded lower workings himself, logging readings at intervals down to nearly 600 feet, the deepest safely accessible point given the flooding and partial collapse below that level. The readings climbed steadily with depth, nothing dramatic in the upper levels, roughly consistent with normal groundwater temperature for the region, until the deepest accessible readings, which came back at a consistent 94 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 40 degrees warmer than the shallow water above it and far warmer than any ordinary aquifer in Barlow County had ever been documented producing. Foster contacted the Idaho Geological Survey that February, describing his readings and the shaft's depth and history. The response came back more interested than he'd expected. A field geologist named Dr. Priyanka Shastri, who'd spent much of her career studying Idaho's low-temperature geothermal resources, drove out within 2 weeks, skeptical but professionally curious, and left considerably less skeptical after reviewing Foster's methodical, carefully logged data alongside her own confirming instruments. What Dr. Shastri's team eventually documented, over several months of follow-up testing, was a legitimate, moderate-temperature geothermal resource, water rising through a fault structure that ran beneath the old mine workings, heated at depth and channeled upward through decades-old mine tunnels that had inadvertently become the cheapest, most direct access point to a resource nobody in the region had ever properly identified. It wasn't large enough for utility-scale power generation, but moderate-temperature resources exactly like it had, in other parts of Idaho, proven valuable for direct-use applications, greenhouse heating, aquaculture operations, and district heating systems for nearby municipal buildings. Uses that required considerably less infrastructure than electrical generation while still representing real, sustained economic value. Word moved quickly once Dr. Shastri's preliminary assessment became public record through the state survey's normal reporting process. Within a month, Foster had fielded inquiries from a regional geothermal development firm, a university research program interested in studying the resource's long-term output, and, notably, the Delacroix family's attorney, who wanted to understand exactly how firm the original sale had been now that the ground they'd sold for scrap value had become, by conservative independent appraisal, worth several $1 million in long-term development rights. Foster's own sale had been clean, thoroughly documented, and entirely legal, and Idaho law left no ambiguity about subsurface resource rights following an unrestricted property sale. He didn't gloat about it. He met with the Delacroix family's attorney once, listened respectfully, and confirmed, through his own counsel, that the matter was settled. What Foster chose to do next surprised Grady Pemberton and most of Barlow County more than the discovery itself had. Rather than selling the property outright to the highest bidder, Foster spent the following year working with Dr. Shastri's team and the regional development firm to structure a long-term lease agreement that kept the land in his name while providing a steady royalty stream, and, at his specific insistence, dedicated a portion of the resource's direct use capacity to a modest greenhouse operation supplying produce to Barlow County's small food bank network, a project he built and managed himself on a corner of the property once reclamation work made it safe to use. Grady came by the following spring, walking the newly stabilized shaft collar with an expression considerably more thoughtful than his warning tone from 2 years earlier. "I told you that ground was dead," he said. Foster shrugged. "Everything looks dead until you check what's still moving underneath it." Grady didn't have much to say back to that. Danny drove up from Boise more often after that first year, no longer worried in the same circling, careful way he had been, watching his father build something steady and specific out of a piece of ground everyone else in the county had already buried in their minds. Foster never made much of what happened at Wren Gulch. When people asked how he'd known, he usually said some version of the same thing. He hadn't known, not with certainty, only that a retired inspector's 50-year-old offhand comment about warm water had bothered him enough to check, and that checking, carefully and without assuming the answer in advance, was the only part of the job he'd ever really trusted. There is a particular kind of value that survives underground, unnoticed, for exactly as long as nobody bothers to look. Foster Cray didn't set out to find several $1,000,000 beneath a collapsed silver mine. He set out to solve one more problem the way he'd solved problems his whole working life, patiently, underground, and without assuming that dead ground on the surface meant nothing was still moving beneath it.